Now, tell me which one you think is real. The second one is by Rupi Kaur, who sold millions and became the harbinger of Instagram poetry. And the first one is by a random girl you see on the internet.
You're just hating on Queen Rupi's success. As Watkins says, that's effing pathetic. Cancel her. She's so fake. She changed her opinion.
The haters are right. I guess I am just a hypocrite because 3 years ago, I thought that this poetry was deep. Yeah, so deep. Alright, let's get down to expressing myself. We've already established that I'm a hypocrite because around 3 years ago, I read Milk and Honey and I loved it and I recommended it to literally every single person. Bestie, I'm embarrassed for myself. Let's look at it this way. Are you embarrassed that you had your emo phase in 2015? It's embarrassing, but only because you don't like it anymore. Today, I want to talk a little bit about insta poetry and express through discussing this like subgenre of poetry, as it's sometimes referred to, what my views are on poetry right now and how I judge whether something is like good poetry or bad poetry. If you don't know me, hi, I'm Polina. Welcome to Polina's Pages and let's start. What is insta poetry? Well, it's basically a Pinteresty type post that you can save that contains a pretty mini doodle and 3 lines of affirmation, and then at the bottom there's a dash with the title. The reason it's so popular is because it repeatedly tells you that you're good enough. It's the new type of self-help for those people who want to help themselves and validate themselves, but they want to do it intellectually. It's the new type of, I'm not like other girls, I'm not like into vast stuff. In the last couple of years, there's been a huge increase in mental health advocacy, and that's great. The stigma is not completely gone, but in my generation at least, I do believe that we're discussing the topic a bit more. We actually managed to make depression cool. More about why that's not necessarily a good thing later, but the point is there is now a market for books like this. And when there's a demand, people want to sell stuff and get on the money train while it's still popular. So insta poetry is doing well for itself. Anyone can do it because it's social media. So because anyone can do it, all you need to start is to go on Pinterest. Oh, first you need to register, right? You find a pretty picture of a sunset, you download it, you choose a Times New Roman font, you put it on top, bang, who needs the 3 million hours of editing? You post it, you mass produce your poetry books, and you sell them to the market, which is basically young women. And all you need to do to sell your stuff and to be the next Rupi Kaur success story, because I'm assuming that's what you want, to make millions off of your poetry, is to just say that it's empowering, it's feminist, it's relatable, it's the universal female experience. And because it needs to be relatable, it typically covers the same thing, the same themes, and the same writing style. It needs to be accessible. It needs to be so that you can mass produce it, remember, so that anyone can read it. Shakespeare, iambic pentameter, that's dated. Poetry does change because the views of people change, the times change. Of course, it's natural for things to change. So I don't think it's a bad thing that it's changing, but it's just that there's a certain level of word choice that's gone. I'll talk about that. A poem doesn't necessarily need to rhyme, or it doesn't need to have that like meter as it was with like old poetry, but I do like it when poems do that. I think it adds a melodic quality to the words when you read them out loud, and it doesn't need to be this necessarily super hard language that nobody understands for it to be a great poem. We'll discuss that, but it's just that there's a clear difference in what is the popular poetry right now, what is being mass produced on Instagram, and what is the old type of classics poetry, the way that the message is put out. For example, Leaves of Grass, Walt Whitman. I am mad for it to be in contact with me. The smoke of my own breath, echoes, ripples, buzzed whispers, love roots, silk thread, crotch and vine, my respiration and inspiration, the beating of my heart, the passing of blood and air through my lungs. Rupi Kaur has definitely talked about this at some point. They're both romantic, right? But it's just that hers, it's much simpler and it doesn't have that specific word choice that makes you picture it so much. It's more simple, it's more about that message. Or for example, let's look at the more like fierce, rebellious type poetry. All youth is a revolt of death, and all revolts are eventually quelled. The trick is in that moment, with a rock in your hand and tear gas in your eyes. Can you smile to the fates? Stand tall and make your work heard. That's some of the better poetry out there, but as you can see, it's different in terms of language. So the issue here that I have is that it's pretty words, it's a pretty message, but it's not necessarily pretty language. I think that poetry, it shouldn't just touch you emotionally like that as well, but it should also be, not to be like cliche or anything, it should ring in your brain when you say it. You should take pleasure from not only the idea that the poet is putting in your brain, but just from saying these words, from feeling these words. It's just that this poetry is more about acknowledging your feelings rather than really ringing with you, as I feel was the idea with poets in the past. But it is a poetry for the new age, or a short attentive span. What is insta poetry, right? It's something on Instagram, you're scrolling through your feed, you see this poem, you're like, oh, that's relatable. You click or share, you feel good about yourself because you're interacting with poetry instead of mindlessly scrolling, and then you go right back to mindlessly scrolling. And there are a lot of modern poets who of course amaze you with their message. It's just that they don't necessarily have this shocking display of skill. How important exactly is writing for you? That's part of the things that I look for in my poems. I think that if you're a poet and you know it, then you should have this skill. It's part of your defining quality as a writer, that you have this amazing ability to wield words and to know what sounds well with another, and to know that when your reader will be reading it, they just won't be able to stop. And sorry, not to be like super like pretentious and snobby and say that, oh, like modern poets can't write. No, of course I'm not saying that, but it's just that I see these trends in insta poetry, this simplicity, and I guess it's just not what I'm looking for. And another problem with insta poetry is that it's very similar, but it's not like the type of similar where it's like Taylor Swift, who thinks a lot about breakup and love because it's a universal theme. It's not like Ed Sheeran, who has a lot of models in his videos because they relate to the song and it's all about love. It's not like that type of similar where it's actually similar but like good. It's like similar in a way where every poetry collection seems a little bit like someone wrote the homework once and then everyone else just copied off it and made minor changes. It's guaranteed to cover breakup and love and trigger warnings, we'll talk about it later, and like big things. And I realized that these are just universal themes. We talk about love all the time. Love is just important for humanity. Music, poetry, film, it's everywhere, right? It's very similar, and you know for a fact that if you open a certain poetry collection and the covers all look kind of similar, then you know that there's for a fact going to be this moment of rehealing. It's just that these poems are written in these affirmation styles, as I said before, in this like simple, down to the point, and I guess that's why it seems so similar. And I know originality is a completely different topic, like is there anything original left in the world? We can discuss that. By the way, I hope you like this format. I want to make more of these types of videos. I think it's fun and I want to hear your thoughts too. I'm working on a huge commentary on One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest video essay, mini video essay, my first one. I'm really excited for that, about the whole harassment thing and about like repeated themes, because it's empowering and it's marketed as empowering. There's a lot of let's talk about harassment and then let's get over it, but just imagine what it's like for survivors to read something like that. It's one thing if it's actually good, but what if it's just another repetition of like, oh, you're strong, you're a mountain, you move on with your pain, and adding like a doodle of like pain. There's a really big focus on insta poetry with the whole pain defines who you are. And I just have a really big problem with that, because of course pain is an important part of your life. It really does change your outlook on life, but it's not pain who takes that step to move on. It's you. Is it really that good of a message to be putting out to women who are vulnerable right now and who are looking for validation, to be like, oh yeah, of course, like pain hurts, but you know, that's just like a normal part of being a woman. Like in your relationship, lines such as I gave myself to you but you didn't give yourself to me, but it's okay, like pain is a part of the relationship. I realized that they're not meant to be as abusive as they sound. It's probably more about like, oh, he's not paying enough attention to me. It's just that I'm wondering whether it's really the message that we should be spreading. And I feel like there's a very strong focus on the actual like abusive type of pain, and the message behind this is always like, yes, we live in a patriarchal society, yes, of course women are gonna hurt, but like don't worry, like you'll get over it, but you're gonna hurt. Feel the pain, ladies. Poetry, this kind of poetry, it's spreading the message that pain is a necessity for growth further, when it should be telling us that yes, pain is normal and everyone feels it, but it's you who work through it and you who will be able to work through it. Like, don't stay in a relationship if it's hurting you so much. It shouldn't be abusive. There's certain kinds of pain that shouldn't be there, and we shouldn't tell all these vulnerable young women. And poetry doesn't have to be the views that you agree with, of course not, but I think that one of the great features of poetry is a certain level of poetic expression, and what this Instagram poetry does is that it not only tells you that pain is a necessity, it does it like straightforward. There's no room for you to think about what the poet is trying to say, like no matter the message. It's just given to you, and there's no layers and depth that you see. There's no room between belief and the central message of the poem. And there's no depth and ambiguity and the layers that you seek. You just get told that pain is a process. It's not even like remotely suggested that it's normal and then just kind of left to the reader to decide what to do about it. You just get told, you use this for growth. You have to feel this. It's normal for women to feel this. It's normal for women to be hurt. And I realize I'm saying women a lot. Please don't take it as me being like, oh, men aren't abused. The person in the poem, the subject is a she. It's mentioned as she did this and he did that. He is kind of the villain and she is kind of the victim, and the victim is repeatedly told that what she's feeling is normal. I know a bit about romanticizing things before I'll talk about what makes a good poem for me, now that I've discussed and ranted about this enough. It's also the mental health. These poems, they have a certain type of sad girl aesthetic where it's like, oh, she has depression, she's so sad, she's so special. Depression isn't this thing that it's cool to have. No, it's something that stifles you a lot, and sometimes you can't get out of bed in the morning because it's really hard for you. You're depressed, you know? I think if you have depression, you're incredibly strong, that you're moving on, the way you carry yourself through life. But let's not romanticize depression. It's kind of cool that she's depressed. Maybe I'm depressed. That's not the message we should be putting out to people, especially vulnerable people, that having depression, that lying and not being able to move is a symbol of your inner strength. And my issue here is not only that it's romanticizing this image of depression, it's also the suggestion of a solution that it provides, that like, oh, are you depressed? But how can you be depressed? There's a wolf inside you. It's howling. Just like, look at the moon. Remember that the moon is your true home. Depression is romantic. Oh, the moon is also romantic. And like channel this like moon inside you and stand up and go, wow, you're cured of your depression forever. Influence some people and convince them that whatever they're feeling is normal and not to go to a licensed therapist, and then you're gonna tell them to stop being depressed. So that briefly is what I hate about insta poetry. But I also want to say that like electronic cigarettes are called the gateway to smoking, so insta poetry is the gateway to perhaps exploring poetry deeper. This is just my thoughts on what makes a good poem a good poem. Okay, and the first on that like criteria list is an absence of cliches. And as weird as it is to say this, Leaves of Grass is less likely to contain cliches. There's less of that repeated thing. When Walt Whitman was alive, there wasn't social media to see these like normal metaphors that is a convention to use. And I don't think I've ever seen an old poem have a reference like, your eyes are like the galaxy, you're a wolf that can be caged, all that stuff that appears everywhere in modern poetry. And I'm not saying that all contemporary poetry lacks in originality. To be honest, I just haven't taken the time to explore it beyond insta poetry because that was enough for me, and I don't want to stumble on more Gabby Hanna lookalikes, because I do firmly believe that our generation is talented and we can produce amazing poetry, but it's just I don't like insta poetry, and I don't think that's it, and I don't think that's a place where you can find the kind of poetry that I consider good poetry. I want poems to shock me with the associations that they provide. The reader should stumble upon a certain word, even though it fits in so well with the rest of the poem, and just have that image stick in their minds. To compare visionaries and people with radical new ideas to shadows because they have so much light going out, or to compare like wreath to birth and to reproducing and to the continuation of humanity. Light bulb moments where they realize that, wow, I never thought of it like that, but that's what it is. And it's funny for me that we overanalyze everything sometimes. Not everything is what your English teacher wants it to be. Maybe the curtains are not a veiled reference to his latent homosexuality. Maybe they are just curtains. Maybe the mirror she has lying over there, it's not actually a metaphor for how she wants to see her true identity and she doesn't know who she is. Maybe it is just a mirror. But in serious works, when there's a certain level of complexity, I love it that sometimes you can take a second look, you can read over the poem, you can focus on different things and make a note of those, and suddenly realize that there's just so many ways that you can view it that it's completely different. Suddenly you have a completely new, a fresh take on what you have in front of you, and your neighbor, they have a completely different interpretation. And that's part of the reason that I don't think that you can ever be fully wrong in poetry. I mean, of course there are interpretations that are further from the truth, let's say that, but it's not like you can ask the poets, especially if they're dead. And also, I mean, if they can justify it with quotes, even if it's different from your interpretation, I don't think you have a right to tell them that it's wrong. And finally, good poetry for me is the space to have that imagination that I talked about. It's something that's provoked by the artist's unique writing style, by their grasp on language, by their choice of words, and you just realize that, like, wow, this poet, they're a metaphorical god or goddess in your eyes. And poetry is just such a personal thing, and it evokes a very personal response, which is why I'm not judging you if you like insta poetry. I just don't like it myself. Again, I don't know. I guess what I would say my definition of poetry is just a piece of writing that evokes an image for you, that is an emotional provocation. Provocation, is that a word? You find yourself recalling certain lines in certain situations. Even many years later, you suddenly realize that, like, oh my god, that poem was so good, and then you go and you revisit it. So that's that. It's very brief. It's a huge rant because it just has been staying in me for so long, and I felt like I needed to let that out, especially because I got an arc and the author asked me to review it, and I realized it was insta poetry too late in. That's gonna be an uncomfortable conversation to have with the author. But of course, let's be respectful to each other, so I'm just going to say outright the things that I didn't like, but also praise them, because I think it's admirable that a lot of these poets are just putting their work out there to improve. So I don't want to be the hater just pulling everyone down. As long as you're practicing your craft, right? Who am I to stop you? I'm definitely not certified, so please don't like attack me in the comments being like, oh, who are you to hate on the queen Rupi Kaur? Yeah, I'm no one. I'm just a person who likes to read poetry, and this is just my opinion. So yeah, and I'm really interested to know what your thoughts are on poetry. What do you think makes a good poem? So like what you want. Thanks so much for watching the video. Leave a comment and bye.